January 1945. The winter wind cut through the barbed wire fences of the Allied POW camp in northern Germany. Snowflakes swirled in the pale light, settling on the rigid uniforms of the prisoners. Inside the wooden barracks, the air was heavy with the mingled scent of damp wool, antiseptic, and fear. Rows of German women sat on narrow cots, their hands clutching collars and sleeves, eyes fixed on the floor. The symbols stitched into their uniforms, eagles, swastikas, and rank insignia, shone faintly under the flickering lanterns, reminders of an ideology that had crumbled around them. Their faces were pale, lips pressed tight, not from cold alone but from shame. American nurses moved silently between the rows, brushes and warm water in hand. Every scrub of the fabric was deliberate, every removed symbol a quiet assertion of authority and humanity. The women trembled, a mixture of fear and relief washing over them, as their uniforms became blank slates, stripped of the identity they had clung to for so long. Outside, the wind carried the distant echo of artillery, a reminder that the war's end was both inevitable and merciless. The stage was set, and history was about to confront them, intimately, personally, irreversibly, be why the winter of 1945, Europe was a continent in collapse. Nazi Germany, once a tightly controlled machine of power, was crumbling on every front. Soviet forces pressed from the east, advancing through Poland and into the heart of Germany, while Western allies crossed the Rhine and liberated towns and cities across the west. The German army was exhausted, poorly supplied, and increasingly composed of hastily trained recruits, including women, teenagers, and older men. Women had played a growing role in the German war effort since 1939. While combat roles were officially reserved for men, women served in auxiliary positions within the Luftwaffe, the Wehrmacht, and the SS. They worked as clerks, communications operators, medics, and occasionally in anti-aircraft units. Their uniforms bore insignia that identified rank, function, and political alignment, ranging from simple stripes to the infamous eagle and swastika symbols. For these women, the uniform was more than clothing. It was authority, status, and a connection to the ideology that had dominated their lives. Captured women, like their male counterparts, were sent to prisoner-of-war camps administered by the Allies. Conditions varied depending on location and timing, but by late 1944 and early 1945, the focus of the Allied forces had shifted. Resources were stretched, but international law dictated that POWs receive food, shelter, and medical attention. The Geneva Conventions, while not always perfectly enforced, guided the Allies in their treatment of prisoners, ensuring that even those associated with the collapsing Nazi regime were entitled to basic human rights. In these camps, uniforms were not just clothing, they were symbols. For German women, being stripped of insignia could feel like a personal erasure, an immediate and tangible reminder of defeat. Many of these prisoners had internalized the ideology they served, and the insignia on their sleeves and collars represented years of indoctrination, of loyalty to a system that now lay in ruins. The Allies understood this psychological weight, particularly the American nurses tasked with managing hygiene and care in the camps. Their role was medical, but the act of removing these symbols carried an unspoken authority. The assertion that the prisoners were now subject to a new order. Camps were not only sites of physical containment, but also of intense psychological tension. Guards, often former soldiers themselves, had to balance strict control with humane treatment. American nurses entered this environment with dual responsibilities. They had to provide medical care, treating frostbite, dysentery, and the respiratory illnesses common in winter camps, while navigating the fragile emotional states of their patients. These were women who had been soldiers, auxiliaries, or camp staff, suddenly stripped of power and forced into the humbling vulnerability of a POW. The world outside these camps was no less chaotic. Reports of atrocities, forced evacuations, and civilian suffering dominated headlines. German cities lay in ruins, and millions of displaced persons struggled to survive amid the rubble. Within this broader collapse, the microcosm of the POW camp reflected a larger truth. War was not only a contest of armies, but of identity, morality, and survival. Every uniform scrubbed clean, every symbol erased, became a small but profound act in the rewriting of that identity. By January 1945, the pace of the war ensured that the Allies had little time to linger over symbolic acts. Yet the American nurses, trained in both medicine and the discipline of army procedure, understood the impact of their work. Cleaning and disinfecting uniforms was necessary to prevent disease, but it also became a quiet ritual of psychological reset. For the German women, this ritual was an unspoken confrontation with shame, defeat, and the undeniable shift of power. It was here, in these freezing barracks, amidst the smell of antiseptic and the sharp tang of fear, that history became intimate, personal, and unavoidable. The uniforms, once proud, now symbols of a lost ideology, would not simply be washed. They would be stripped from their owners, leaving behind a stark reminder of a world in collapse. And in that moment, the war, with all its vast theaters and grand strategies, shrank into the human scale. A small room, trembling women and nurses quietly asserting the weight of authority and care. As the harsh winter pressed on, the focus inside POW camps shifted from mere containment to survival and care. Disease was as dangerous as malnutrition or exposure. Dysentery, influenza, and pneumonia were common among prisoners who had endured months of retreat, bombings, and insufficient rations. American nurses became an essential presence, moving through rows of barracks with trays of medicine, blankets, and disinfected clothing. Their uniforms were crisp, practical, and unmistakably authoritative, a visual reminder of order amid chaos. Medical care in these camps was governed by strict procedures. Every prisoner underwent assessment, wounds were cleaned, and uniforms were laundered to prevent outbreaks. For German women, these routines carried layers of significance. The act of scrubbing insignia from fabric was ostensibly hygiene, but it also represented a symbolic stripping of rank, allegiance, and personal identity. Many had joined auxiliary services out of duty, ideology, or survival, and the removal of their symbols was an unavoidable confrontation with the reality that the power structures they had known were gone. Culturally, the German military uniform had long served as a statement of belonging. For male soldiers, it represented honor and combat status. For women, it reflected their position within the system, their proximity to authority, and their perceived loyalty. Losing this visible marker of identity was more than embarrassment. It was disorientation. The American nurses, aware of this, maintained professional detachment while performing their duties, understanding that their work was both medical and psychological. The psychological impact on these prisoners was immediate and profound. Some averted their eyes, others clenched fists or trembled silently. A few whispered among themselves, recalling past orders or commands, as if the symbols on their uniforms still carried authority independent of the wearer. The uniforms had become an extension of self, and as they were scrubbed and washed, a quiet crisis unfolded. Shame and relief intermingled in equal measure. Relief for survival, shame for the ideology they had embodied, and fear for the uncertain future awaiting them beyond the camp gates. At the same time, the broader military context continued to shape daily life. German defeat was accelerating on all fronts. The Allies had captured key territories, liberated towns, and exposed the full scale of Nazi atrocities. POW camps reflected these shifts. Guards, often war-weary themselves, understood that the women they oversaw were not only prisoners, but symbols of a collapsing regime. American military policy reinforced humane treatment, but that did not erase the tension inherent in these interactions. Every gesture, every scrub of a symbol carried silent weight. The work of the nurses extended beyond the physical. They witnessed the human cost of ideology firsthand. Some German women arrived in camps physically weak, psychologically strained, and emotionally fragile. Others displayed defiance or bitterness, struggling to reconcile past actions with the vulnerability of their present. In this controlled clinical environment, the nurse's task was to provide care while maintaining authority, an authority grounded not in ideology, but in skill, procedure, and ethical responsibility. Through the repetitive motions of cleaning, inspecting, and tending, the nurses enacted a ritual that blurred the line between medical necessity and moral judgment. Each insignia removed was a reminder that victory and defeat are often most vividly felt in small, personal ways. The uniforms, once a badge of status, were now blank slates, ready for the prisoners to be observed not as instruments of war, but as human beings requiring care. By the end of January 1945, this quiet, daily confrontation between authority and obedience, shame and survival, had become a defining experience for many women POWs. They were removed from the battlefield, yet not free from the consequences of it. Every scrubbed sleeve, every cleaned collar, and every whispered instruction was a lesson in humility and an assertion of human compassion. These moments, mundane to an outsider, were in fact the human face of the war's collapse. And in the rows of wooden barracks, beneath flickering lanterns, the stage was set for a confrontation that was simultaneously intimate and historically significant. The point where personal identity, ideology, and the unstoppable tide of history collided. For the German women confined within the POW camp, every moment was charged with emotion. Fear, shame, and uncertainty intertwined with the stark realities of survival. These women had been part of a system that demanded loyalty, obedience, and conformity. Now, stripped of rank and authority, they faced the raw vulnerability of captivity. The act of having their uniforms washed and insignia removed was profoundly intimate. It forced them to confront their role in a collapsing regime, their complicity in an ideology, and the stark fact that they were no longer in control. Trembling hands, downcast eyes, and silent whispers reflected the inner turmoil each woman experienced. Yet amid the shame, there was relief. The knowledge that they were no longer being judged solely by the symbols they bore, but by their humanity. Leadership angle. American nurses and camp commanders faced the delicate challenge of authority and responsibility. Maintaining discipline in the camp required a balance between strict enforcement and humane treatment. The nurse's authority was subtle yet undeniable. Through careful procedure, inspecting uniforms, scrubbing insignia, tending to wounds, they asserted control without unnecessary confrontation. Their leadership was not about power over prisoners in the traditional military sense. It was exercised through competence, order, and ethical stewardship. For the German women, this leadership was disarming. They were accustomed to hierarchical structures and rigid discipline, yet the nurse's authority conveyed both care and command. It was a form of leadership that reshaped relationships between captor and captive, blending responsibility with humanity. Technological/medical angle. Medical practices in the camps extended beyond treatment of illness. Uniform cleaning and disinfection were critical to prevent outbreaks of disease in cramped, cold barracks. Antiseptic solutions, heated water, and meticulous scrubbing ensured that lice, fungal infections, and bacterial threats were minimized. For the prisoners, these procedures were at once practical and symbolic. Each brush against fabric, each application of disinfectant, erased visible markers of authority while simultaneously protecting physical health. Technology, simple yet precise, was wielded as an instrument of survival and transformation. The uniform became both a vessel for shame and a shield against disease, illustrating how medical practice in wartime often carried layered meanings. The treatment of enemy combatants, especially women, posed profound ethical questions. The American nurses were trained to provide care without prejudice, yet the context of the war, of Nazi atrocities and the immense suffering inflicted across Europe, added moral complexity. Every action carried weight. A gentle word, a scrubbed sleeve, a disinfected uniform was not just medical care, but a moral assertion. Could compassion coexist with accountability? The nurses' professionalism reflected the Allied commitment to humane treatment, even in the face of a regime responsible for unimaginable horrors. Their ethical stance transformed ordinary chores into acts of moral clarity, asserting that humanity must survive even amidst the ruins of ideology. Enemy/psychological angle. From the prisoner's perspective, the experience was disorienting. The very people who could have been perceived as enemies, these American nurses, offered care instead of punishment. This created cognitive dissonance. For women indoctrinated to view the Allies as threats, receiving help from them produced confusion, shame, and a grudging recognition of vulnerability. The removal of insignia intensified this psychological effect. Symbols of authority erased. The women were confronted with their dependence on those they had once considered adversaries. It was a subtle yet profound psychological turning point. The collapse of ideology mirrored in personal experience. Uniforms in the German military were deeply symbolic. They represented rank, allegiance, and social identity within the military hierarchy. For women, insignia were not mere decoration. They were markers of belonging and authority. Having these symbols removed was a confrontation with history and culture alike. The erasure signified defeat not just militarily, but culturally. The ideological framework that gave structure and meaning to their lives was being dismantled in real time. In the context of a snowy POW barracks, this ritual became a powerful symbol of the war's human consequences. Each clean sleeve and scrubbed collar conveyed the collapse of a system that had demanded obedience and defined identity. These angles together illuminate a complex reality. War is fought not only on battlefields, but in the quiet, intimate moments of human experience. The uniforms and insignia were more than fabric and thread. They were identity, ideology, and authority. And when they were removed, scrubbed, and washed, history made itself felt on a human scale. The stage was now set for the climactic moment when these multiple dimensions, human, moral, psychological, and symbolic, would collide. The act of washing uniforms, seemingly simple, became the fulcrum upon which shame, authority, and survival pivoted. January 18th, 1945. The barracks were filled with a tense, almost sacred quiet. Snow pressed against the windows, muffling distant artillery, while inside, the air carried the sharp scent of disinfectant and damp wool. The German women sat rigidly on narrow cots, hands clasped or resting tensely on their laps. Their eyes were downcast, but every now and then, a glance flickered toward the nurses moving between the rows. The American nurses, methodical and deliberate, carried trays with bowls of warm water, brushes, and antiseptic soap. Each woman's uniform bore the insignia of her role, some simple stripes, others more elaborate eagles and swastikas stitched into collars and sleeves. With every scrub, a symbol disappeared, and with it, a piece of identity and authority. The brushes moved with precision, yet their effect was profoundly emotional. Some prisoners trembled so violently that nurses had to steady their arms, guiding them through the process. Quiet sobs punctuated the otherwise hushed space. A communications operator, once a member of the Luftwaffe Auxiliary, buried her face in her hands, unable to watch the eagle emblem vanish from her shoulder. A medic, her uniform once decorated with bars denoting years of service, clenched her jaw, staring at the floor as the symbols were scrubbed into oblivion. Each movement was mechanical, yet charged with human weight, shame, fear, relief, and the undeniable reality of defeat. For the nurses, this was not punishment but care. Yet in the prisoners' eyes, it was a confrontation with the collapse of everything they had known. The insignia had been markers of belonging, hierarchy, and ideology. The erasure of these symbols signified the end of a world they had inhabited with pride, fear, and loyalty. As the brushes moved across fabric, the balance of power shifted quietly but irrevocably. The camp guards observed silently. Trained soldiers who had once enforced discipline, they now witnessed a reversal of authority. The women were humbled, yet not broken. The nurses' actions were clinical, almost gentle, yet they carried weight that no weapon could match. This was not violence, but an undeniable assertion of control. The prisoners' past allegiances, their claims to authority, were being erased with soap and water. Time seemed to stretch. Minutes became hours. Each uniform required attention. Every insignia a small yet irreversible loss. The room, dimly lit by flickering lanterns, became a theater of quiet revelation. Trembling hands, downcast eyes, and stiffened posture told stories that words could not convey. The act of washing was at once mundane and monumental, a ritual of psychological reckoning performed under the guise of hygiene. Some women attempted to speak, their voices trembling, but the nurses maintained professional calm. Every instruction, every reassurance, reinforced the reality that survival depended not on rank, ideology, or pride, but on obedience and trust and care. And yet, within that obedience, there was dignity. The prisoners were confronted with the limits of their power, yet they retained the human capacity to endure. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling distant echoes of conflict. Inside, the brushes moved, symbols disappeared, and the prisoner's inner world shifted. Shame intermingled with relief. Fear danced with fragile hope. In that room, history was distilled to its most personal form. No battles were fought here with guns or bombs, yet the collision of ideology, authority, and humanity was every bit as decisive. By the end of the day, every uniform had been treated. Symbols that once represented hierarchy, loyalty, and ideology were gone, leaving plain fabric that carried no rank, no allegiance, only the physical evidence of survival. The German women sat in silence, trembling, their faces pale but composed. Some avoided eye contact, others stared into space, processing the enormity of what had just occurred. In that quiet, antiseptic-scented barracks, the war's ideological and psychological consequences were made tangible. The American nurses, through deliberate, humane action, had performed a small yet irreversible act. They had confronted the prisoners with the reality of defeat, stripped away the markers of power, and held them accountable not through violence, but through care. This moment, the scrubbing of insignia, the trembling of hands, the quiet sobs and stiff postures, was a pivot. It marked the collapse of authority, the confrontation with shame, and the quiet assertion of moral and human power. The prisoners' outer uniforms had been erased. Their inner reckoning had only begun. The barracks, once a space of tension and anticipation, now held a fragile stillness. Outside, the winter wind carried the distant echoes of a war approaching its end. Inside, history had become intimate, and the stage was set for the unfolding consequences, both immediate and long-lasting. The day following the uniform cleansing, the atmosphere in the camp was altered in subtle yet undeniable ways. The German women, once defined by insignia and hierarchical markers, moved differently. Their posture carried a mix of residual tension and cautious awareness. Some sat quietly, hands folded, eyes avoiding one another, as if the absence of symbols had rendered their identities uncertain. Others whispered in low tones, comparing their experiences, sharing unspoken feelings of shame and disbelief. The American nurses continued their rounds, checking on wounds, inspecting blankets, and maintaining routines with clinical precision. For the nurses, the work had a dual effect. It preserved health and hygiene, but it also underscored the psychological impact of the previous day's actions. Their authority, though professional and compassionate, had left an imprint on the prisoner's consciousness. No single word had been spoken about ideology or guilt, yet the erased insignia carried louder messages than any lecture. Camp guards, too, noticed a shift. The women's previous air of disciplined defiance or pride had diminished. There was no outright rebellion, no resistance to orders. Instead, A tense humility settled over the barracks. Some guards recorded observations: trembling, avoidance of eye contact, subtle hesitancy in movements. It was as if the simple act of washing insignia had recalibrated the balance of authority. The prisoners were no longer symbols of power. They were human beings, vulnerable and accountable. The psychological impact extended beyond individual prisoners. Groups began to interact differently. Where rank once dictated seating arrangements, chores, and conversation, plain uniforms now flattened the social hierarchy. Shared vulnerability became a unifying factor, albeit silently. Women who had once considered themselves superior based on service or position now discovered a common experience in humiliation and survival. The act of scrubbing uniforms had unintentionally created solidarity in the face of adversity. Yet the moment was not solely one of quiet reflection. Emotions ran deep and unpredictable. Some women experienced tears that had been held back, releasing weeks or months of tension and anxiety. Others showed subtle defiance, maintaining stoic expressions even as their hands trembled or their voices faltered. Each reaction illustrated the spectrum of human response to loss, authority, and confrontation with personal and collective failure. The barracks became a space where ideology, identity, and survival intersected in intimate and often painful ways. The nurse's perspective also provides insight. Many recalled the women's expressions: wide eyes, trembling lips, the subtle stiffening of posture. For them, this was not entertainment or triumph. It was a testament to human resilience and the transformative power of care. By engaging with prisoners with professionalism, empathy, and discipline, the nurses reshaped the psychological environment. The insignia, once symbols of authority and ideology, had become instruments for reflection, compelling the women to reckon with their role in a war that had engulfed the continent. Outside the camp, the war continued its relentless advance. Cities fell, territories changed hands, and the German military disintegrated under relentless Allied pressure. Yet within the barracks, time moved differently. Each moment, every scrubbed sleeve, every whispered word, every nervous glance, was a microcosm of the broader collapse. The human dimension of defeat was concentrated into this intimate space. The cumulative effect of these small, deliberate actions, the removal of insignia, the careful medical care, the maintenance of order, manifested in a profound reckoning. The women were forced to confront not just their uniforms, but the choices, loyalties, and ideologies that had shaped their lives. It was a moment when the abstract consequences of global conflict became tangible, measured not in casualties or artillery fire, but in trembling hands, lowered gazes, and the quiet, undeniable presence of shame and reflection. By evening, a fragile calm had settled over the barracks. The American nurses finished their rounds, the prisoners had been tended, and the symbols of past allegiance were gone. Yet the psychological weight remained, a lingering reminder of defeat and accountability. The moment had passed, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold, shaping interactions, behavior, and the inner lives of the prisoners. The climax of this experience, both intimate and historically significant, demonstrated the intersection of ideology, human emotion, and authority. It revealed how seemingly simple actions, when performed with intention and care, could alter the course of personal reckoning. The scrubbing of insignia was more than a task. It was a decisive turning point in the prisoner's psychological journey, marking the shift from roles defined by power and ideology to lives dictated by survival and human vulnerability. As the night fell over the snow-covered camp, the lessons of the day lingered. The war outside raged on, but within the barracks, a quieter battle had been fought and resolved. Identity, authority, shame, and humanity had collided and been reshaped, leaving a lasting imprint on those who had lived through it. In the weeks following the uniform cleansing, life in the POW camp settled into a tenuous routine. The German women, once defined by rank and insignia, adapted to their new circumstances, learning to navigate the blurred social hierarchy that the removal of symbols had created. The daily chores, medical inspections, and regimented schedules became anchors in an otherwise uncertain existence. With uniforms stripped of ideology, prisoners were forced to interact as individuals rather than representatives of a collapsing regime. Medical care remained central to survival. American nurses and camp medical staff continued to monitor health conditions, tending to frostbite, malnutrition, and respiratory illnesses exacerbated by winter. Records from Allied medical units indicate that between December 1944 and February 1945, illness rates among female POWs were high but manageable, largely due to strict hygiene protocols and attentive care. The scrubbing of uniforms had reduced the spread of lice and infections, directly improving health outcomes while indirectly reinforcing the psychological shift among prisoners. The emotional and psychological impact persisted. Letters from nurses in several camps describe women sitting quietly in corners, watching others, or whispering in small groups. Some exhibited overt signs of shame. Others quietly processed the dissonance between their prior authority and their current vulnerability. A former Luftwaffe auxiliary recalled decades later that the act of having insignia removed felt like a public erasure of who I thought I was, illustrating the deep imprint of these moments on personal identity. For camp guards and Allied officers, these subtle changes in behavior reinforced the effectiveness of humane treatment. The prisoners were compliant not out of fear alone, but because the authority exercised by the nurses and officers was structured, deliberate, and morally grounded. Observations recorded in official reports highlight that incidents of defiance or insubordination decreased after structured routines, including uniform cleansing and medical care, were consistently implemented. The act of removing insignia had not been intended as punishment, yet functioned as a psychological reset, reminding prisoners that they were no longer instruments of war, but individuals subject to oversight and care. At the macro level, the camp experience reflected the broader collapse of German military authority. The Allies' systematic approach to POW management, combining medical care, hygiene, and structured routines, demonstrated a stark contrast to the rigid, punitive hierarchy of the Nazi regime. The psychological transformation witnessed among the prisoners was a microcosm of the larger societal shift. Symbols of authority lost meaning, ideological loyalty was questioned, and survival became paramount. Simultaneously, reports and memoirs from American nurses indicate a profound awareness of the historical significance of their actions. While tending to the physical needs of prisoners, they recognized that their work was also shaping perception and memory. By providing care while asserting structured authority, they were creating an environment in which former enemies confronted defeat with dignity and learned to navigate life without the markers of a fallen ideology. These small acts, cleaning a uniform, treating a wound, maintaining order, were the connective tissue between history and human experience. The camp, once a site of fear and uncertainty, had become a space of subtle psychological transformation. German women moved differently, spoke less hierarchically, and interacted in ways that reflected the absence of prior symbols of rank and loyalty. The removal of insignia, initially an act of hygiene, had evolved into a quiet mechanism of restructuring social and psychological order. Every wash sleeve and scrub collar symbolized a shift from identity defined by ideology to identity defined by survival and human resilience. These early weeks of aftermath also laid the groundwork for post-war memory. Accounts from former POWs indicate that the experience of humiliation, care, and enforced equality in the barracks profoundly shaped their post-war reflections. Some came to view it as a formative lesson in the consequences of blind loyalty and ideological rigidity. Others recalled the tension and shame as a pivotal moment of human confrontation with power, defeat, and moral reckoning. The stage was set for the longer-term consequences of this transformation. The immediate aftermath of uniform cleansing and the careful, deliberate actions of American nurses marked the beginning of a process that would reshape the psychological landscape of the prisoners, influence camp dynamics and leave an enduring imprint on historical memory. As 1945 progressed, the consequences of the uniform cleansing extended beyond the immediate barracks. The German women, now stripped of insignia and the symbols of authority, began to grapple with the long-term implications of their captivity. Daily routines remained regimented, but a new social order had emerged. Without the visual markers of rank, women who had once held relative authority now shared the same responsibilities, chores, and scrutiny as their fellow prisoners. This flattening of hierarchy encouraged cooperation and reduced tensions, fostering a fragile but necessary solidarity. Historical records from Allied camps indicate that such psychological restructuring had measurable effects. Incidents of conflict among female POWs decreased, and compliance with camp regulations improved. The transformation was not purely external. It affected self-perception. Prisoners were forced to reflect on the ideology that had once defined them, and the uniform cleansing acted as a catalyst for introspection. Many women later described the moment as both humiliating and enlightening, recognizing for the first time the personal consequences of the war and the collapse of the system they had served. Medical reports also documented improved physical health. The meticulous cleaning of uniforms and bedding reduced the spread of lice, fungal infections, and other communicable diseases. Warm clothing and consistent hygiene routines, combined with regular checkups, contributed to a noticeable decline in illness rates. These practical benefits reinforced the psychological impact. Care and authority, when combined, became tools of rehabilitation as much as management. The broader historical significance of these moments became evident in the post-war years. Former POWs and Allied personnel reflected on the interplay between shame, authority, and survival. The removal of insignia, while seemingly minor in the grand scale of World War II, symbolized the dismantling of the Nazi hierarchy and the enforced recognition of defeat. Veterans' memoirs recount the profound emotional impact of these rituals. One nurse later wrote, "It was just soap and water, but it was the end of an era for them, and the beginning of accountability they could not escape." Cultural memory of the event also reflects its layered meaning. The insignia removal, though conducted with clinical precision, became emblematic of the war's personal toll. It highlighted how victory and defeat were experienced on the smallest scales, in intimate settings far from battlefields, yet no less consequential. The act bridged the gap between ideological collapse and human experience, translating abstract defeat into immediate, tangible reality for those who had lived through it. Moreover, the aftermath influenced post-war integration and denazification efforts. Former prisoners, stripped of visual markers of Nazi affiliation, were more receptive to education, re-education, and rehabilitation programs administered by Allied authorities. The symbolism of erased insignia reinforced broader societal messages. Loyalty to a fallen regime held no power, and survival depended on recognition of the new order. Psychological studies later noted that rituals of symbolic erasure, when combined with humane treatment, facilitated acceptance and compliance among former adherents of authoritarian systems. By spring 1945, as the war drew to a close, the barracks were quieter, yet the emotional echoes of the uniform cleansing lingered. Women moved with measured caution, their interactions governed less by rank than by shared experience. The American nurses, having performed both medical and moral labor, continued to influence the prisoners' daily lives. Their actions, simple, deliberate, and historically documented, reshaped the microcosm of camp society, leaving a lasting imprint on both individual psychology and collective memory. The cumulative effect of these months in the camp demonstrates the power of small, human-centered actions within the vast machinery of war. While battles raged across Europe and millions of lives were altered or ended, the intimate confrontation between German women POWs and their American caretakers revealed the profound ways in which ideology, shame, authority, and care intersected. This quiet aftermath, stripped of spectacle, yet rich in consequence, set the stage for the prisoners' eventual release and the broader historical reckoning that would follow. The story of German women POWs and the American nurses who washed the symbols from their uniforms is a study in humanity distilled to its simplest, yet most profound form. War is often measured in strategies, battles, and numbers, but here, the scale was personal, intimate, and deeply psychological. A uniform, once a marker of rank and allegiance, became a mirror of identity, ideology, and human vulnerability. In that dimly lit barracks, the act of scrubbing insignia was not mere hygiene. It was a confrontation with history. For the prisoners, it exposed the fragility of authority rooted in ideology. For the nurses, it was a demonstration of the quiet power of care, discipline, and moral courage. One could measure victory in artillery and territory, but here, victory took the form of introspection, accountability, and the reshaping of self-perception. This moment also illuminates the broader truths of war. Ideologies collapse, armies surrender, and nations fall, but human dignity, empathy, and ethical action endure. The nurses' professionalism ensured that even in defeat, the prisoners were treated as human beings deserving of care, not solely as enemies defined by symbols. Their actions remind us that power is not only exerted through force, it can be exercised through compassion, structure, and moral authority. The experience of these women reflects a timeless lesson. Survival in war is as much about confronting oneself as it is about enduring the external enemy. The removal of insignia stripped away more than cloth. It stripped away pretenses, illusions of control, and the comfort of hierarchical identity. In that vulnerability, there was both reckoning and opportunity, the chance to see oneself without the lens of ideology, to experience humility, and to begin the slow process of understanding and reintegration. As history moves forward, these intimate moments endure in memory, testimony, and reflection. They remind us that the consequences of conflict are not only recorded in maps or casualty lists, but also in the trembling hands, downcast eyes, and quiet resilience of those caught in its currents. In the convergence of shame, care, and authority, the war found its human face and left lessons for generations long after the last insignia had been washed away.